Trafficking is defined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of commercial sex acts or labor or services using force, fraud, or coherence. According to the United Nations 2016 report on trafficking in persons, women and girls make up 71% of all human trafficking. The Counter-Trafficking Data Collaborative found that 60% of identified sex trafficking victims were recruited by a family member or intimate partner, and 87% of identified labor trafficking victims were recruited by a non-family member, such as a friend, acquaintance, business contact, or neighbor. And the FBI's Innocence Lost National Initiative discovered the life expectancy for sex trafficking survivors to be 7 years. We need to end trafficking. Welcome to Normalize the Conversation. I'm your host, Francesca Regeter, and today I'm joined by human rights activist Sophia Fisher. For over 5 years, Sophia has been working in the anti-trafficking space with a passion to help open the conversation while educating us on how to identify trafficking and understand how it manifests. Join us as we dive deep into human trafficking, from definition to warning signs to saving lives. Sophia, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we jump into our conversation, I just want to check in with you. How are you really?
I'm doing really good. Thank you, Fran, for asking. I think with these past few years and being online, it was definitely challenging for me working in a space that's very heavy and talking about human rights violations. It's not easy, and finding support groups and people that you can talk to is so important, but I'm doing really good and excited to keep making a difference, and very, very uplifting to see people like you in this space that are really doing check-ins rather than just asking questions that appear to be formalities and not wanting to dive deeper. So I applaud you and I really admire that.
Thank you. And you're right. It's so hard to be online and separated from people in a space that's so heavy. I mean, the stories that you hear and listening to it over and over again and feeling so passionate and actually being able to feel it inside of you, and it hurt. If you don't have that support group, that online support, it can be so difficult, which is why I love having these conversations, because by bringing awareness, bringing more information, we can increase that support so people don't feel so isolated. So jumping into human trafficking, can you tell us a little bit more about what human trafficking is?
Yeah, human trafficking, at least when I first was beginning to understand more about what the crime actually is, I had no idea what it looked like. I'm sure many of us have thought about, the movie, the Taken series. There's a few of them, right? And when you watch the movie, there is a scene, or there's a few series of events that happen that would fall under what we would consider human trafficking, or what we would consider it to look like, at least from how we've seen it portrayed in media. And if you haven't seen the Taken movie series, what happened in that film was the main character, Liam Neeson, had his daughter who was kidnapped in Paris. She was taken with her friend and they were sold against their will for sex. And while this would fall under the definition of human trafficking, this is not how human trafficking mainly happens. But before I get into talking about those myths, what really is human trafficking? Human trafficking is force, fraud, or coercion. When you are being sold for sex or forced labor, human trafficking doesn't just have to look like sexual exploitation. It can fall under that work element as well with forced labor. And then something we don't really talk about in America a lot is organ harvesting. And we're seeing that more predominantly in other countries. But those are the three main types of human trafficking. And of course, they can look different in every scenario. There's no really, I like to say this a lot, there's no type A situation of human trafficking. But I would say it usually is going to fall under some type of sexual exploitation, forced labor, or organ harvesting.
Thank you for clarifying the definition of what it is and what it can look like. And I know we're going to break down some of those myths and misconceptions, because we hear people talking about human trafficking. We see the signs on the bathroom stalls and in different restaurants, they have it up, but most people don't actually know what it is, or they know a very specific piece of it. So they know that sex trafficking is a thing, but they don't know about the other aspects. And like you said, with the movies, I personally travel by myself all the time across the continent, and it stresses my family and my friends out so much that I go anywhere alone because in their minds, from my mom specifically, she watches a lot of Lifetime movies, and she thinks that if you walk outside in California alone, you're going to be trafficked. And I'm like, that's a very, very specific scenario. It does happen, and not to like say it does not happen, but this fear that so many people, I want to say everyone has this fear, but so many people have this fear that they're going to walk outside alone, they're going to travel alone, they're going to go do something, and they're going to be sold into sex trafficking.
Yeah, I definitely would say that it's not a completely irrational fear on your mom's basis. A lot of
Yeah.
my family is the same way, or people that I talk to whenever I've gone and done trainings on human trafficking. And we see kidnapping crimes all the time, sadly, in this country and around the world. And usually the two are not connected. And so the crime is a very real fear in and of itself. But if the fear is of trafficking, it's important to understand how human traffickers operate. Usually, what human traffickers do is they target vulnerabilities. And it can be quite hard to understand someone's vulnerabilities if you don't know someone and if you don't have an established relationship. There are things that can increase that vulnerability factor, struggling with mental health, and if that is apparent to the trafficker, homelessness. There are a lot of things that being a part of the LGBTQ community and feeling like you have no resources, things that may be apparent, let's say on social media, if you affiliate with something and you may not have those resources, those are things that you can sometimes tell from the outside eye that a human trafficker might say, here's something that I can't exploit. But a lot of times it takes a relationship to exploit something. And it can't really be done if you're being kidnapped, right? And of course, those scenarios do happen. But how we're seeing it play out in America and how this crime is really transpiring is traffickers are exploiting those that they know. So that could mean family members, it could be significant others, it could be employers. And depending on whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, it looks a little bit different on the breakdown of who they really are targeting and then who they are as well. So it kind of goes against the grain of what we would really think about of I'm going to the mall and there's a tag on my car and a human trafficker is doing that to identify me. I'm going to say right now, they never use that tactic. There may be evil people out there that are looking to do ill harm and create some other type of, scenario, but human traffickers tend to not operate that way. I'm going to tell a little story now so it can kind of put this into perspective a little bit more. As I said earlier, there's no type A situation, but this is just one that came to mind as we're talking about how it really looks and how can we identify this. So about a year and a half ago, I was working with the Attorney General, and we were working on a human trafficking case, the Attorney General in Ohio. And one of the cases we were working on involved a young girl who was being sold for sex by her mother. And this is now I don't want to say a perfect example, but this is how it often happens and we don't even see it. And when I was helping, my boss, the prosecutor, work on this case, it just continually shocked me because I didn't know that it could look so evil, so terrible. I didn't know that if someone was desperate for drug money, that they could sell their daughter in rural America. I think we're always told it happens at the Super Bowl only. It happens in big cities. No, it happens in the small town on a farm. And that just blew my mind because I didn't think that that could happen. And in addition to that story, one of my goals and one of our entire goals at the office while working there was to reach out to different courts in the various districts in Ohio. So we could really start establishing a process for it was called John Schools, and what that really is, it's a rehabilitation process, and it's done to administer to various sex offenders and those that would fall under this crime, so that they understand the consequences of their actions, ultimately done to reduce the idea of this demand for sex and labor. And when we were establishing contact with a lot of these different districts and courts, those that, it fell under their jurisdiction to administer this type of program, there were a few calls, and one that stands out in particular where I remember the person on the phone who I was speaking with said, "We don't have a need for that here." And while I was taken back by that at first and really almost was frustrated internally, but that anger was misplaced. I mean, it was normal for me to be frustrated, but how can I be mad at someone that doesn't know, in a culture where we don't talk about this stuff and they genuinely are acting out of what they believe to be in good character, and they're not trying to do ill harm. They didn't know. They just didn't know. And so my job wasn't to argue with them into, realizing that they needed this program. It was to kindly point out, no, human trafficking happens in every zip code. It may look like an employer exploiting someone on an H-2B or an H-2A temporary work visa. It could look like a mom selling her daughter for drug money. And this is how it's manifesting. And it may not look like the Taken movie series where your daughter is being kidnapped and then sold across the country. That is the work that needs done, talking about how it actually happens. And those are just a specific, few stories that, I was able to work directly on, but that's the type of stuff we need to really be talking about if we want to have an idea of how it manifests.
I completely agree. And these stories, again, go to show your point that it's not just, you know, going to the supermarket and someone kidnapping you, taking you the air tags on your cards. Those are very real things to be afraid of. 120%. It does happen, like you said. But that is not necessarily the main way that human trafficking is happening. And when we're utilizing that fear, or we're saying that the fear is human trafficking, and then we're not understanding where it's coming from, how it's happening, we aren't able to make progress in reducing it, in stopping it, and having those rehabilitation programs, like you said. We can't make progress and change anything if we're not understanding what's actually happening and how we can prevent it, how we can recognize these warning signs, how we can step in, how we can support somebody who may be a survivor of trafficking as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And another thing that really started to shift my perspective, working with the AG in Ohio certainly did, but I try to do a decent amount of research on this issue. I try to speak with survivors. I think that's most important if they're willing and want to share their story. And that just gives me a whole new perspective. But I remember reading this book. I believe the author was someone from Ohio State University. She's a professor there, and I think it was co-authored, but the book was titled something along the lines of The Cause and Consequences. And really what it is a book that details, what is human trafficking? How would it meet this legal threshold to constitute that? But besides all of that in the book, the author had used a story of someone, I believe, that she heard firsthand prior to human trafficking becoming a federal crime. So that officially became a federal crime with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000. So this is only just something so new, as it's only 22 years old, or 23 now. And she had detailed a story of a survivor in the beginning of her book. And I think that was really powerful, but also needed. You can read all you want about what is force, fraud, or coercion. You can read all you want about labor trafficking, sex trafficking, and I think that you should understand it. But hearing from survivors is important. And I want to touch on this specific story really quick to give a little bit better of an understanding, and because it really impacted my understanding of it as well. So in the beginning of this book, she had given this survivor an alias or had said her name. I don't recall, but I remember what had happened in the story because it was so heartbreaking. There was this lady who was dating this guy, and from my understanding of when I read it, he was a super sweet guy to her, right? We may, at least in our culture now, see things done at the beginning of a relationship. If it's done a ton of times to win somebody over, we might call that love bombing rather than just genuine nice acts. It might turn into something where maybe some from an outside eye would wonder, like, why are they doing so much? Why are they buying me so much? Is there an underlying motive? But a lot of times you don't detect that, right? Someone is just doing nice things. We're in a relationship. And so she had detailed and described that. And the woman that had wrote this book was talking about her story and said that she was in this loving relationship, but it wasn't like she woke up one day, she's in a loving relationship, and the next day her boyfriend, also known as her trafficker, decided to exploit that. And I think that's something that I think is so important to talk about because it's not just that switch usually. How does that happen? So it's a process called grooming. And so for her, what did that look like? It looked like her boyfriend love bombing her at first and then continually becoming more abusive. And so it started out like a domestic violence situation. And then beyond that, it continually progressed into something where then he sold her to other people as well. And I believe in the story, the author had said that she was taken to a hotel and then he was telling her to have sex with his friends or clients. And this is just the heavy stuff that breaks my heart, but we need to talk about it because if we don't, their stories aren't told, nothing is done. But it's not just the switch that gets turned on to where suddenly her boyfriend, her significant other, is her trafficker. It started out in a seemingly lovingly relationship, and then it turned abusive, and then progressively got to a situation where she was being sold to his friends. And this is the part about this story that made me never forget. But I didn't even know this was a thing until I read this. So listener discretion here if this is going to trigger some of you. But he ended up even forcing her into sex with animals as well. And I didn't even know that trafficking could be intertwined with bestiality as well. And so that story kind of put a pit in my stomach, to say the least. But it's so amazing that survivors like that have come forward, but they can't do that without resources. And so I'm going to take a little pivot to talking about that for just a second. Most survivors don't live past 7 years. That's their life expectancy after coming out of this industry. That is so sad because we like to use the word rescue a lot, which I don't know if I love that word, but those that are victims or victors, I would honestly say, that have come out of this, they deserve to live a life that is joy-filled and peace-filled. But when you have been on average, and again, listener discretion, if you've been raped a couple thousand times every year and sold an average times 10 times a day for sex, even more than that sometimes, the trauma is so immense that follows. And so what is needed? Counselors, free tuition, free support and housing. There's so much that needs to be done. A lot of NGOs are doing this, but there's a lot of legislation right now that I'm seeing pushed at the state level, which is really great to see, that is allowing the state to come in and say, this happened to you, you are entitled to receiving this care. We're not going to forget about you, and it should be done that way. And if you are in a position of change and you're listening to this, I reach out to me on Instagram, wherever, really. I would love to point you in the right direction to where you can get in touch with some of these legislators that are really pushing this policy forward. And if this is something that's not done at your state level or you want to see done, please talk to me and reach out. But this is what needs done. Not only the stories being told, not only it being talked about, but resources given to them as well, because they deserve a quality life. They deserve to live.
They do, and there's not enough conversation on what resources are available, but it brings me so much hope to see that there's legislation coming through, that people are stepping in because, like you said, they need access to care. And it can be so expensive and so difficult to even get a therapist today. And so many people, again, that stigma, that fear, that shame of what happened to me, and I can't talk about it. So being able to have those resources available to make it okay to come forward and say, I need help, and to know you can actually get support instead of being afraid of what are people going to think? No one's going to help me anyways. I have
Um,
to live in this shame forever makes all the difference.
you mentioned earlier, excuse me, sorry, I think I had something stuck in my throat for a second. But you mentioned earlier the signs in the airport or other various public places. And I think those that create those signs, or maybe it's through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, I think they're needed and I think they're fine. But how can people come forward when they don't even know they're victims themselves? And that's a lot of times what we're seeing. How do you just tell somebody, if you are a victim of human trafficking, call this number? Well, a lot of times victims of human trafficking, whether it be, again, forced labor, sexual exploitation, don't know that they are a victim. Of course, there are signs of abuse there, and they internally feel that it's wrong and it doesn't feel right, most likely. But putting a name on it, such as human trafficking or that crime title, they don't realize that they would fall under that. And so I think messaging is important as well. Or I think even in how we talk to other people, if you notice something is off, yes, of course, report it. Please do that, but ask people questions if you're in a position to do so. Do you feel safe? Do you have access to legal documentation? Things like that that would indicate either an existing vulnerability or something isn't right in a situation. I would always advise against never asking the question, are you a victim of human trafficking? Because even if they are, and if they think they are, they may not answer, because that is a very forward question. And also they may not know. And so really the needle might not be moved at all there. And so again, don't want to knock something that is well intended. But if you have the opportunity to talk with someone that you may suspect is a victim of human trafficking, I would avoid from asking that question and ask underlying issues or things that may indicate that, right? Do you feel safe? Do you have a physical location you can eat, drink, and sleep at? Things like that that are crucial.
Yes, language matters, what you say, how you ask. Because
Right.
also, if someone is currently a victim of human trafficking, there also is that could be that fear of maybe they're listening to them. And it's going to maybe there was threats. If you tell anybody, I'm going to hurt your family, I'm going to hurt this person. So
Right.
by directly asking, you could put them in more distress of fear of consequence,
Yeah.
or actually could result in consequence. So knowing the right questions to ask, how to ask them is so important. And going back to what we said about the signs, I love that there are so many signs out there because it's starting the conversation. But one thing that I feel that there could be a lot of improvement, and it goes for all hotline signs, whether it's if you're in crisis, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or call 988. If you are a victim of domestic violence, call this number. But there's not enough information on what are the signs? How do I know? And not only call this number, but what resources are available then? What does it mean when I call this number? Because calling the number can be terrifying if you don't know what's going to happen on the other end of the phone. Am I going to get in trouble? Is something going to happen to me? Can this number be traced? So I agree with having signs that start the conversation, but I think there needs to be more information, more conversation available on what resources are available, what it means, what it looks like, and what happens when you reach out. Because no matter what you're going through, it can be terrifying just to even say, like, I'm not okay today. Imagine saying, I am being human trafficked.
Right. Yeah. I totally agree with you. And it's really neat to see if you're not familiar and you're listening to this, it's really great to see what Polaris is doing. They are the center for the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They have done a great job to consolidate a lot of resources. And while messaging that number, you can text it now, which is great. You can call it. You can either do that to report, to access resources, and they can point you in the right direction. But each state is also going to vary as well, which is why we need to continue to push for that support. But if you're looking for an organization to support, or you want to come alongside survivors, I would look into local resources and NGOs, whether it be a safe house. And if there isn't a safe house in your area, there is an organization that I love and support called the Safe House Project. They are a fantastic team of people looking to continue to build more homes across America, more beds, more resources. And so if there's not something in your area, there's something in my area called Rahab, and they work on doing just that, providing a safe house, not revealing the names of survivors that live there, providing the care that they need. If there's not something like that in your area, look into that project I mentioned, the Safe House Project. I believe it's the safehouseproject.com or .org. You can go to that and find out and learn more about them. And they actually talk about legislation a lot as well. So if you want to get updates on that and sign petitions, their website and their entire resource base is fantastic to look into.
Thank you so much for sharing those resources. It's so important that people know where to go, how they can get involved, how they can help, what support's available. I really want to go back to those warning signs that we were talking about earlier, because, like you said, people may not know that they are being trafficked. What's the difference between domestic violence versus trafficking? What's the difference between, oh, I am being asked to do all these direct labor tasks versus I am being trafficked for direct labor? So how do we know the lines? I'm helping somebody or I am in a dangerous situation.
Yep. That can be so gray and so blurry sometimes. Even I will look at a case and sometimes wonder, like, how is that not met maybe the definition for human trafficking or the threshold, right? And usually in a human trafficking case, it's going to combine the force, fraud, or coercion element. And they have to be there in order for that to constitute a situation of human trafficking. You may not always be able to recognize it from an outside eye. There's probably a lot that you don't know that's going on behind the scenes, which is why I would recommend that you ask questions, again, if you're in a position of authority to do so. But I would always report things if you really are unsure, whether it's 911 or the hotline. That is always the way to go. But I would say general warning signs that you can look for are if someone's autonomy is restricted, and that is a very general rule, but what does that mean? Are they restricted in their movement? Do they only have certain places in which they're allowed to travel? Is that them mandating that, or is that someone else doing that? And if someone else is doing that, why is their movement being restricted? Is there a reason that would be justifiable in doing so? Do they have a health condition, or is there some type of exploitative behavior going on behind the scenes potentially? What are their living conditions like? Do they have access to water and food and a stay? And a lot of times trafficker or victims do have access to that. Maybe it's not a great condition. So I think those are then questions asked as well, what are your living conditions like? And again, if something is raising a red flag to you, it doesn't mean it's a human trafficking situation, but these are things that can be indicative that something exploitative is happening or human trafficking situation. Usually there's going to be that exchange for something, whether it's monetary, whether it's goods, drugs being the case in the example I said earlier. So it doesn't always have to be monetary, but usually there's some sort of that exchange taking place. And then in the farm example that I mentioned earlier, or a general example of where an employer is exploiting an H-2B or an H-2A visa worker. I see that a lot for labor trafficking cases. And a lot of times for those specific cases, Documentation is seized. They don't have direct knowledge of where they live or autonomy in that sense, and everything centers around their employer. They are being told that they have to pay off a debt, and there's this fictitious debt. And a lot of times they are being told they're sent money back home, and they're not. And so they're working on that false idea. There are a lot of those elements that are taking place there in exchange for their labor. That is a lot of times how I'm seeing it manifest on the labor side, especially whether it's in the highest. How do I want to phrase this? The most common type of industry that you see under forced labor is domestic work, from what we do know, and so that could look like someone inside the house. That could look like cleaning, a babysitter. And then from there, you can go into other categories like, hospitality, agriculture. But the most common type, at least what we've seen from reporting, is domestic. And I remember reading a case years ago of this lady who was on a temporary work visa, and she was living in California with her employer, and they were in a gated community. I mean, super rich community. And she, I believe, was from India, saw a job ad in a newspaper, came to California, and was living with her employer, working 17 hours a day and only getting a rice bowl every so often, and being forced to do work and being held against her will. One day she was able to leave the house and get the attention of the authorities, but that family or that employer wasn't caught until the second time that he was doing it again.
Wow.
Which is just crazy. But again, looking very different from the drug situation earlier, but there are common signs that you can look for. And I would say the overarching one is what's being done to reduce someone's autonomy. What are the red flags that you see in this relationship? It may not come to the threshold of becoming a human trafficking situation, but regardless, you may end up helping or save somebody's life by noticing red flags in general.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing those red flags. It's so important that we report something if we feel like it's suspicious. I I think a lot of people sometimes are afraid to maybe insert themselves and ask questions or reach out for help on their behalf
Yeah.
because it's not my family, it's not my situation, it's not my kid, it's not my spouse. So maybe I should stay out of it. But if you're seeing these red flags, like you said, you're seeing the exchange, the lack of autonomy, it's so important to reach out. That doesn't mean the person is going to be taken away right away. It'll go under an investigation. And like you said, he wasn't even caught until the second time. So by not reaching out, by not reporting the red flags, by not saying something, we are allowing it to continue. And
Mhm.
that's really important to recognize when we're staying silent because we feel like maybe it's not our place. We are allowing a system of abuse, a system of hurting people, of something that's ending so many people's lives. We're
Mhm.
allowing it to continue because we think silence is the answer. And in today's world, I mean, silence has never been the answer. But in today's world, we have enough resources, we have enough knowledge, we have access to so much more information than ever before. There is no excuse for us to stay silent, especially when we have that gut feeling that something's wrong.
And I'm really excited that you mentioned that, because I think that Gen Z and millennials especially are are generations that are really pushing this forward. Not that the others aren't, but we're the ones that grew up in the digital age, at least for a
Yeah.
large part of our life, and it's continuing. And we have the power and ability, like you're doing on social media, to bring conversations like this to the forefront. And then from there, we mobilize, have call to actions. We're changing the world. And there's so much that needs to be done, and we never want to settle and stop doing that. But it's exciting at the same time. It's terrible because the more that we continue to become connected and things are broadcasted online, the more we find out about evil. But it's this, we have an opportunity on how we choose to respond to that. Are we going to mobilize? Are we going to push for legislation? Are we going to rally together? I think that's a really neat trait that Gen Z has, especially. They're a generation that comes together, that when they see something devastating happening to people or the planet or whatever, they're like, no, we are going to do something about this. We're not going to take some general vague answer from a politician and just be okay with that. We're going to make our voice heard. And I love that because it directly relates to the issue of human trafficking, because without talking about it, like you said, nothing is done. And Gen Z is such a powerful voice that I'm really excited to continue watching how they really change the way that this country talks about and fights and just combats human trafficking.
And that's why I love being part of Gen Z so much because we are seeing that trend that almost everyone, I feel like everyone, at least in my circle that I know, that I follow, that I connect with, is so willing to speak out, to have a conversation, to post resources on their stories or on their Instagram pages. On Twitter, they're going out and fundraising or volunteering or just doing something, actually going out and voting, making their voice heard in some way and not being so, I don't wanna say other generations were afraid to talk about it, afraid to go out. They just, maybe it was that lack of access to information where they weren't hearing it every day like we are. Every time I open Twitter, there's something evil happening in the world, and it's breaking my heart. But to see a whole generation really coming together and being so willing to talk about it, to put that information and resources forward brings me so much hope for the future. But I really
Yep.
want to switch gears into something you mentioned earlier about how um, individuals who are survivors of trafficking tend to live on average 7 years. Let's talk about that. Why is that average 7 years?
A lot of it is due to the immense trauma that happens. Um, I have a friend, she's a survivor, and she was, again, listener warning, she was raped several thousand times every year. And if that happens for years on end since childhood, the trauma that follows, think about what happens from one, you know, essay event in somebody's life. The trauma that follows. And I'm not saying the word just to downplay, but from one event, right?
Yeah.
What does that do to your mind, your heart, your gut even? It can produce health issues. Your mind and your gut are so connected, and a lot of times what, happens in your mind, your gut tries to process, and if your mind isn't at peace, your gut probably isn't at peace as well, and I'm not trying to get in a whole medical discussion, but a lot of times what happens with these victims is a lot of unresolved trauma, but how could it not be that way? Years of being, sold against your will, whether it's labor, sex, maybe a combination of both. Years of trauma, unresolved coming out of that. Sometimes it's the trauma that may lead to someone physically passing away. Maybe it's the trauma plus I didn't have access to this, or suicidal thoughts, which is why it's so refreshing to see what you're doing with your organization and podcast to really bring that to the forefront, because so many people, whether it's for a moment or a longer period of time, have struggled with those thoughts. And for survivors, that's also very real. Many of them have had that. So they don't feel like they have the resources, the trauma on top of that, that all contributes to why there's an average life expectancy of 7. And I believe that my friend I'm talking about actually made it past the 7-year threshold or is really close to. I think she's past it now, which we are so excited when we talked about, because truly she's a statistical anomaly. And that's sad, but it's exciting to see that she is beating the odds and moving forward. So it's sad to see the life expectancy is 7, but again, I think we can change that. And I think the resources are going to help make that number something else. I think it's going to be a way longer and hopefully quality life.
Absolutely. And I'm so excited to hear your friend has made it past that threshold because that has to be terrifying for not just your friend, but also you as a friend, for family members, for loved ones to see someone who's gone through it and wanting to be there and support them and knowing the statistics, knowing the numbers. It's like you said, there's not enough access to resources or information about the resources. A lot of people aren't able to get help. And I mean, one event in your life can change everything when it comes to your mental health and your depression and suicidal ideation.
Right.
To go through something so traumatic over and over and over again and not have any control, any power, how do you get through that without any resources, without any support, without people who have that information and knowledge? And as a future therapist, that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about having these conversations. And I hope to see other therapists and future therapists wanting to get involved in these conversations and learn how we can support someone. Because if you haven't been there, if you haven't been in that situation, it can be so hard to know what to say, what to look out for, what they're going through, and how to be that support. So not only is it access to resources, but access to quality and competent resources as well.
It's refreshing, and I'm excited to see you continue to walk in that, because we need more people that are wanting to be on the front lines of that. We need more people that are willing to financially give to support that. But I wanted to pull my phone up just for a second to like make this even a little bit more real. The numbers vary, and I know that human trafficking, as aforementioned, can include labor, forced labor. It can include organ harvesting, sexual exploitation. But while we're on the topic of sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, I wanted to just run the numbers a little bit. They say it's usually about anywhere from 10 to 16 times a day sold for sex. Let's just even going on the lower side. Maybe let's do 11, and let's say they're sold every day for a year. That's 4,015 times a year. And so let's say they're in that industry for 3 years, that's over 12,000 times. And it's not even trauma. It is trauma, but it's psychological abuse. It's administering drugs in between so that there's a dependency on the trafficker. And so coming out of that, a lot of times there's drug relapse, there's alcohol abuse. That combined with all of the trauma and the weight of what happened, and that 12,000 number for 3 years. I know people that have been in this industry for almost probably 7. So then if you're taking, let's say, 4,000 times what, 7? That's like 20,000 plus times, almost 30,000. And I wanna put numbers on this because it changes how you think.
Yeah.
So, if you're listening to this and that's blowing your mind, it should, because it's disgusting and it's terrible, and we can't change everything. Sadly, this crime is gonna continue, but I really do believe we can change the frequency in which it occurs. I believe that we can give survivors resources, and I'm excited, Fran, to see people like you, whether it's directly in this space and working with people that have dealt with this type of trauma, or in general with mental health, because it is so needed to talk about this. And I think our generation, Gen Z, is fed up with having surface level conversations on social media apps that are so superficial, but we can actually change them and use them for good to talk about the deep stuff, whether someone's a human trafficking victim or dealing with mental health. It's so important to talk about, and I'm so excited to see what you continue to do with your movement and your passion.
Thank you. And likewise with you, bringing all this information and resources, all the work that you're doing is going to save, and it probably has saved so many lives and will continue to make an impact. Like you said, these conversations have been very surface level for the past X amount of years that they're even been happening. So to see that we're diving deeper, that we're giving a platform and amplifying voices of survivors, that we are talking about what resources are available, what warning signs are out there, is really going to change everything. Sophia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Fran.
Thank you so much for listening to Normalize the Conversation. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. This podcast is an initiative of Inspiring My Generation, focusing on normalizing the conversation, bringing education and awareness to the forefront, and amplifying global voices to spark change and hope. Inspiring My Generation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization on a mission towards suicide prevention through awareness, conversation, education, and support. Connect with us on Instagram at Inspiring My Generation and visit our website inspiringmygeneration.org to learn more about our work and how you can make a difference.